Hello everyone, Hyper here. In this video, I will be trying to predict the melee DPS meta for the first season of Mythic Plus going into BFA. Please keep in mind that this video is purely speculative and just based on information from Legion and from the beta. And going onto actual live servers and when the expansion launches, all of this could change and every single thing that I could say could be wrong, but let's hope it's not. Also, please keep in mind that this only applies to very high-end Mythic Plus. If you're just doing your weekly cap Mythic Pluses, which starting in BFA will be 10s, all of these classes will be perfectly viable. Before I talk about all of the specs, let's have a little discussion about what's important to have in Mythic Plus and what makes a class good in Mythic Plus. With gear also being locked in BFA, that kind of changes how the meta will work, because in Legion, a lot of classes which were maybe lacking survivability or were lacking AoE damage or single target damage were able to compensate for it by using legendaries and swapping gear. With that being gone and having to choose your gear at the beginning of the dungeon before the run, it is more important than ever that a really good class and spec will have a balanced AoE and single target damage. And this can come from either just the way the spec works, or from talents, for example, having a variety of choices between single target builds, AoE builds, and kind of in between hybrid builds is very important. The second thing that a spec needs to have is survivability. At high Mythic Plus keys, most bosses, especially on Tyrannical, do have one-shot mechanics. And for these mechanics, immunities are extremely good, also very good survivability buttons that are not necessarily immunities, but are almost considered immunities when you're doing Mythic Plus. So when I say that, I'm talking about abilities like Feint, for example, on Rogue, for AoE damage. The third thing a class needs to have is utility. And this can either come through party utility, such as giving your party buffs, or it can come through having CC, for example, saps or incaps or polys. Obviously not polys in these cases because we are only talking about the melee DPS. And then the last point, which is fairly important, but I think this is the least important category out of the ones I mentioned, is mobility. A lot of the times on bosses, having high uptime and good mobility kind of go hand in hand. Because if you're able to quickly get out and get back in with a mechanic, then you don't lose uptime, so you're going to be doing more damage than a class with lower mobility, for example. The way I formatted this video, I broke down all of the specs and categorized them into 4 tiers. The very top tier will be the S tier, which is kind of a tier that's used in other games, and it came from Japanese culture. But the S tier is the melee specs, which are extremely good and will most likely see the most use at the very high end. Then in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, those are just the regular tiers based on how good the spec is. Again, just to reiterate, if you are playing a spec that is in tier 3, but you're only worried about doing your weekly cap or maybe pushing a little bit above that, you will be completely fine. And this, again, only applies to the very top end, to people who are trying to push extremely high keys. But as we know, the classes that those players play do affect the meta in the rest of the game. So let's start with tier 3, which is the bottom tier. Here I categorized the Retribution Paladin, the Feral Druid, and the Enhancement Shaman. Retribution Paladin, in my opinion, doesn't have too many options when it comes to talents especially, so its AoE is very limited. And this means that it will heavily rely on how well its one AoE ability, or I guess 2 if you take Consecrate, are tuned. And outside of that, Retribution Paladin, as we know, also lacks mobility quite a bit. And when it comes to survivability, it's actually pretty good because you have Bubble and you're also able to provide Bop to others. Feral Druid, again, just like Retribution Paladin, I feel like it lacks in the talent department. And Feral Druid is one of those specs that I'm really hoping gets looked at in the first major patch of BFA, because it has a lot of issues when it comes to AoE damage. And especially in Mythic Dungeons, what you need is burst damage, and Feral Druid doesn't exactly have that. It has very high ramp damage, similar to Unholy DK, but it doesn't really have the benefits. Its survivability has been heavily nerfed, because Bear Form has been nerfed for non-tank players or non-tank specs. And outside of that, they don't really have much. They're still able to provide that stamp roar if needed through the dungeon, but overall I feel like their damage is their biggest hindrance. When it comes to utility also, they do have a stun, but this relies on you spending combo points on stunning your target instead of doing damage. So again, here you don't just get pure utility that you're able to dish out whenever you want, you have to trade your damage for it. Then Enhancement Shaman is the third, and here Enhancement is about the same as Ret and Feral in that it has a good single target rotation. When I played Enhancement, I really enjoyed playing this single target, but in AoE, it just didn't have the toolkit to keep up with other classes. And this was especially noticeable when you're doing very big pulls and you need that instant burst damage. With Enhancement, just like with Feral, you have to juggle all of your buffs, and you're not able to cleave all that much damage. Also, Enhancement lacks in the survivability department. With the new defensive talent being added, this kind of mitigated that issue a little bit, but overall, Enhancement doesn't really have something that you could consider an immunity, or something like Rogues, for example, a cloak or something similar. Then we're moving up to tier 2. So this may be a little bit biased, but I put Unholy DK, Frost DK, Assassination Rogue, and Survival Hunter in here. So Unholy Death Knight and Frost Death Knight, I will kind of talk about them together because they have very, very similar toolkits. They both have the good AoE talents and a lot of options to spec into AoE damage. And Frost Death Knight, I feel like, will be better than Unholy at lower level keys, where you don't have time to ramp up your damage. Because as we know, Frost Death Knight can dish out damage instantly on demand, and there's nothing that we really need to set up for it. Whereas Unholy, you need to set up your wounds, you need to set up your death and decay, and then, you know, cleave that damage and get your epidemics in, depending on what build you're going with. For defensives, we just have the AMS and Icebound, which is okay up to a certain level, but like I mentioned at the beginning, you do get to a point where that is not enough anymore. And this is why these two specs are only in tier 2. In Legion, Unholy DK and Frost DK both had artifact traits which affected our survivability very heavily, such as reduced AoE damage taken or having Mirror Ball, which removes debuffs. With those being gone, the Death Knight survivability has gone way down. But the damage seems to be still there, especially for Unholy DK. Moving on to Assassination Rogue. In Legion, I would have placed this probably towards the bottom, unless it was a very niche dungeon, such as Upper Karazhan, where it's mostly single target. But Assassination Rogues received a new talent, which is called Crimson Tempest. And this really improved Assassination Rogue AoE, which is where it had the most issues. Obviously, Assassination Rogue is very similar to Unholy Death Knight, where you need to put dots up on everything and then keep them up. And there's also a cap on how many it's efficient to keep dotted up. So if you're doing massive AoE pulls, Assassination Rogue will fall off compared to other classes. But if you're doing like 3 to 5 target pulls, and the pulls are fairly, you know, they take quite a bit of time because you're doing higher keys, then Assassination Rogue can ramp up that damage and do quite a bit. Survivability wise, obviously it's still a rogue. We still have Feint, even though it's been nerfed. We still have Cloak, even though it's the cooldown on it has been nerfed. But the survivability is there because of those two abilities. And obviously, you still have the rest of your toolkit like Crimson Vial and Evasion. Then the last spec in this tier is the Survival Hunter, which has seen again another rework going into BFA. Survival Hunter really seems to have limited AoE capabilities, which is why I think it doesn't really belong in the higher tiers. And also, Survival Hunter, similar to Feral Druid, struggles with the issue that its other spec is ranged. So for Survival, obviously you have MM and BM. For Feral, you have Boomkin. And that is an issue because in Mythic Plus, historically, ranged DPS have been favored at higher keys because they have an easier time surviving things. If you're not up close and, you know, always in danger of dying, like we see with Windwalker Monk is a perfect example for this in Legion. It's a melee DPS with not much survivability, but its damage is so broken that you just take it to Mythic Plus. So Survival Hunter, coming back to it, it has limited AoE, its single target is pretty decent, has okay utility because it does bring Hero back to the game, but again, you could just drums. It has an immunity through Turtle, it has pretty good movement, but the biggest point that's holding it back is its damage and its AoE talents and how well you're able to spec for different situations. Survival really seems like it's one of those specs where you will most likely have a cookie cutter build and you only choose to change the last talent tier. Then moving up to tier 1. Here I have the Arms Warrior, the Fury Warrior, and the Havoc Demon Hunter. Now Arms Warrior and Fury, between the two I would probably rate Fury a little bit higher than Arms, but obviously small changes like that I can't really rate them between each other, so they just belong in the same tier. They're about the same power level. They both bring the same utility. They both have that AP buff to the group. They both have very good AoE damage and single target damage, so with both of them you get the huge Blade Storm. So you do have burst AoE, but not as good sustained AoE on the Arms Warrior, I would say, as you do on the Fury Warrior. So in this regard, I think Fury pulls ahead a little bit. But then on single target, Arms does really well. As far as mobility, you still have Charge, you have Leap, and as far as survival, they did buff the Warrior toolkit a little bit, especially Fury had huge issues surviving in Mythic Plus in the past. But with the damage taken buff or component from Enrage being removed, and actually having a talent that reduces our damage taken while enraged, Fury Warrior is most likely going to see a lot of play in Mythic Plus. For Arms Warrior, again, we have about the same defensive abilities. You have the defensive stance if you choose to spec into it. And you have overall okay mitigation, but it kind of struggles with the same issues as Unholy Decay and Frost Decay, that it's those survivability buttons are good up to a certain point. But once you get to that point and the bosses are just one-shotting you through your survivability, it's very difficult to stay alive unless you get external help from your healer with like an Iron Bark or your Paladin sacks you or something similar. Then the third spec in this tier is the Havoc Demon Hunter. So the Havoc Demon Hunter has very balanced AoE and single target damage, especially with the talents kind of being reshuffled from Legion. We see that Havoc Demon Hunter is very similar to Fury Warrior in the regard that it can do very good single target damage and very good AoE damage without sacrificing one for the other. Havoc Demon Hunter also brings a little bit of utility, especially that they added the Purge button to it that they removed from DKs, so you can dispel enemies, which is, from what I saw, pretty significant and useful in Mythic Plus and in dungeons in general. Then Havoc Demon Hunter also has an AoE stun, which is extremely good. Even though it's a short duration, every other class's stun has been heavily nerfed, so the fact that it even has a stun puts it above a lot of the melee DPS. So in the S tier, we have 3 specs. This is the Sub Rogue, the Outlaw Rogue, and the Windwalker Monk. The Sub Rogue and Outlaw Rogue, I will again talk about these kind of together because they have very similar toolkits. On Sub and on Outlaw, you still have Feint, you still have Cloak of Shadows. On Sub, you have Evasion. On Outlaw, you have Riposte. So you're able to kind of mitigate some of that melee damage. And then you still have the self-heals. These 2 specs kind of shine in different places when it comes to AoE. With Sub Rogue getting an AoE talent, this was mitigated a little bit, but Sub Rogue used to be very priority damage focused. So if you had a big group of mobs and you had one mob that had way more HP than the others, then you just had your sub-rogue on it and you'd Fan of Knives and get all of those huge eviscerates into the big mob. With the last talent tier being changed and actually an AoE talent being added, Sub-Rogue now has much more versatile AoE, where you are still able to do a lot of that priority damage, because obviously your last talent is not always going to be available, because it does have a cooldown, but your overall AoE is much more balanced, and you can take advantage of big burst AoE, or big targeted AoE, where you're able to just Fan of Knives everything around you and then channel all the damage into a priority target. Outlaw Rogue has a much more balanced AoE, where the damage is less about priority targets and more about just cleaving kind of everything around you, but it does still have a little bit of priority damage. And then for single target, both of these specs are very good. Obviously, we know that Sub is very good at burst damage, since you are able to re-stealth between packs. And then Outlaw, with all of its cooldowns up, just has very good damage in general. These two specs, I think, will see a lot of play at the very top end. And one thing that I obviously forgot to mention is their utility, and that is Sap, single target stuns, which is less important, Shroud, and Blind. If you watched high-end Mythic Plus in Legion, you know that a lot of it revolves around being able to skip trash packs. And Sub-Rogue and Outlaw Rogue both bring Shroud to the group. And if your group has Shroud, you're able to get around very big packs that would otherwise be very difficult to do. Since you do have Sap available, even if the path is very tight, you're able to kind of sap your target. Then if there's another CC class in your group, you're able to CC multiple targets and get around them very easily with Shroud. So then the last spec in the S tier is the Windwalker Monk. And the Windwalker Monk saw a lot of use towards the end of Legion because of its damage, most importantly. But even going into BFA, Windwalker brings a lot of things that other melee DPS don't. First thing that they bring is leg sweep, and having an AoE stun, like I mentioned with the Havoc Demon Hunter, is huge for a melee DPS. This instantly puts you above a lot of the other classes. The second thing is, when it comes to utility, they obviously bring the debuff to the target, which is the increased physical damage taken, the 5%. Their toolkit allows Windwalker monks to do very good single target damage. They have very high burst damage, but they also have very good AoE damage. Just like the Fury Warrior, Windwalker monk doesn't really have to sacrifice its single target damage if it wants to do good AoE damage, or vice versa. And this puts Windwalker monks in a really good place for Mythic Plus, where you obviously have to have your talents locked in and your gear locked in. So as long as your stats are correctly balanced and you have everything set up correctly, then your single target damage won't suffer, and your AoE damage won't suffer if you try to choose and do the other type of damage. So Windwalker monks also, when it comes to their survivability, they're probably lower, I would say, than sub-rogues and outlaw rogues, obviously. But their survivability alone would only put them in about tier 1. So these are my rankings for the BFA Mythic Plus melee DPS meta. Do you think I was wrong about the class? Where would you place them if you think I was wrong? What are your reasons behind it? Obviously, a lot of these things will change when BFA actually launches, and this meta breakdown will absolutely not apply because tuning is not perfect as we know it. Sometimes classes do a ridiculous amount of damage and that bumps them up the list. Other times classes are under-tuned and that bumps them down the list. But assuming that everything is tuned correctly and everything works properly as intended, what do you think about this list? Do you think I got it right? Do you think I got it wrong? And if not, please let me know why. Again, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and sub to the channel. And if you'd like to support it directly, then you can check out my Patreon, which is also linked in the description box. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one.